Midnight descent. A terrifying office. Stairwell encounter. Midnight descent. A terrifying office stairwell encounter. I had just left a happy hour with some co-workers, completely wasted by the time I got home. Like any drunk person, I had two priorities: eat and sleep. After grabbing the easiest thing in my kitchen, I headed to my room. I glanced at my mum's bedroom. She was already asleep, then dropped all my stuff and crashed onto my bed. Those were my last moments of peace. I don't remember exactly when I fell asleep, which made it even weirder when I suddenly woke up, my mouth dry as a desert. My water bottle was empty, forcing me to head to the kitchen. I cursed my past drunk self for not refilling it beforehand. The walk was strange. My TV was on, broadcasting news about a murder. Weird, I thought. I was sure I had turned it off earlier. Feeling uneasy, I kept going to the kitchen. It was oddly bright, like daylight. But the real red flag came when I saw my grandfather sitting at the table, casually reading a newspaper. He looked up, smiled kindly, and started talking about a job opening for me. Way too weird, I thought. My grandfather had been dead for 2 years. Before I could ask anything, the doorbell rang. I turned toward the sound and saw, through the glass, the torso of an impossibly tall man. He was so tall that his face and neck were out of view. My hand hovered over the doorknob, frozen. A paralyzing fear gripped me, a kind of terror I had never felt before. When I finally regained control of my body, I did the only thing my fear allowed me to. I grabbed the door with all my strength and screamed for my mother. My voice came out small, fragile, like a scared little kid. And that's when I realized it was all a dream. I woke up instantly, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. Nothing. Just my furniture. But I knew something was wrong. The stench of decay filled my room, thick and overwhelming. I had no choice but to lie down and shut my eyes. After all, I was a 26-year-old woman. I couldn't let a nightmare freak me out, right? Wrong. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt something lurking in the dark corners of my room. I wasn't alone. I gave up trying to sleep and got up 2 hours earlier than usual for work. I told my co-workers about my dream, more as a way to vent than expecting any answers. As the day went on, I managed to forget about the whole thing. That night, I finally slept in peace. Or so I thought. The next morning at work, my friend rushed over, panicked. She had the exact same dream. The only difference was that instead of my grandfather, she saw her father, who had also passed away years ago. After several years ago, I experienced something at my workplace. At the time, my workplace was constantly plagued by problems, creating a highly charged, uneasy atmosphere. Unbelievable order mistakes and on-site accidents in the factory kept happening one after another, and we were buried in handling complaints. From the moment we arrived in the morning until we left in the middle of the night, every day was spent bowing our heads to customers over the phone. Naturally, I wasn't the only one. All my co-workers were extremely stressed out as well. On that particular day, by the time I locked up the office and stepped into the hallway, it was already around 3 in the morning. There were 5 of us: Osho Cho, the office head, Nkakari Cho, the section manager, 2 other co-workers, and me. All of us looked pale with exhaustion, and no one spoke. However, that day, something even more depressing was waiting for us. No matter how many times we pressed the button in the hallway, the elevator never rose to our floor. Apparently, the power to the elevator had been shut off for maintenance only that night, and, due to a mistake by the building management company, our office was the only one not notified. All of us lost our tempers. We pounded on the door, kicked it, and shouted, After that tantrum, which was completely unbefitting for adults, we were even more drained, and one co-worker, S, slumped to the floor. "Guess we got no choice. Let's take the emergency stairs down," Shocho finally suggested. In our building, basically the only way to move between floors is via elevator. There is an external emergency staircase for fire safety, but it's locked tightly from the inside to prevent vagrants from coming in, and it's almost never opened. That day was my first time opening the door to those stairs. At the far end of the hallway, where even the fluorescent lights barely reached, stood that door. A faint green emergency exit sign glowed. Anyone who's worked in an office building might know this, but no matter how densely packed the buildings are, there's often a sort of blind spot no one can see from the main street. Like a valley between building walls, the spot remains dim even in daylight, without street lamps reaching it, and it's a nesting place for pigeons and crows. Our office was on the 7th floor. With no enthusiasm whatsoever, I opened the door first. The moment it swung open, a terrible stench hit me, and I coughed instinctively. The handrails and steel landings of the staircase were coated in a substance resembling melted wax, and from that sludge came an unbelievably foul odor. "This is pigeon droppings," Joshi, Ms. N, said in a near-tearful voice. The back of the building was smothered in pigeon filth. Breathing through your nose felt like it would collapse your lungs. At that moment, the darkness didn't scare me as much as the stench, so I started descending the steel steps. Just a few meters away, the wall of the neighboring building rose. It was literally like a valley. Of course, it was dark underfoot, and the handrail was only about waist high, which felt extremely unsafe. If I misstepped, I might simply fall, or even get wedged between buildings and dangle in mid-air. When I glanced back at my co-workers, they all wore the same grim expressions. Nobody can smile when things are this bad. Realizing I must look the same, I felt miserable. Clang, clang, clang. Our shoe soles clacked hollowly on the metal stairs as we began our descent. I went first, followed by Joshi, then S, then Shocho, and finally Kakari-cho at the rear. With virtually no light at our feet, we moved slowly. No one spoke, and we had just passed the 6th floor landing when, all of a sudden, I heard a whisper from behind. It wasn't a groan or a moan, rather, it was like the muted voice of someone speaking to a friend in a movie theater. At first, I assumed it was someone behind me, Shocho or Kakari-cho, chatting in hushed tones, but something felt off. The whisper was one-sided, continuing even as we trudged down step by step, and nobody seemed to be replying to it. Then, as I listened, a chill began creeping down my spine. I recognized the voice. It was neither Kakari-cho, Shocho, nor S. But I couldn't recall whose voice it was. It was like a gloomy, middle-aged man reciting in a steady, chanting rhythm, almost as if saying prayers. I had the feeling I knew him from somewhere, and yet I was certain he was not someone you'd want to meet on a dark emergency stairwell at 3 in the morning. My heartbeat quickened. I stopped once to glance behind me. Right there was Joshi, looking puzzled. Behind her stood S. I couldn't see Shocho or Kakari-cho. They'd faded into the dark. I resumed my descent, unconsciously quickening my pace. I slipped on pigeon droppings a few times, clutching the handrail in panic. Close calls indeed. But under the circumstances, there was no way to stay calm. We passed the 5th floor, then the 4th. That was when I heard something from behind that I could hardly believe. Laughter. It didn't belong to the man who'd been whispering. It was Kakari-cho's voice. The same Kakari-cho who'd just been with us. This wasn't anything supernatural. Yet, the instant I heard that laughter, It felt like a bucket of cold water poured over me and sweat broke out across my back. Cho was known to be stern and intimidating. He was famously eloquent and a shrewd salesman, but in the office, he was always sullen, and I'd never once seen him laugh. But here he was, laughing. And the best way to describe it, the playful giggle of a child. Between his giggling, I caught the deep, dismal tones of that middle-aged man's voice again, muttering something that sounded far from enjoyable. Yet Cho responded with unbridled delight. Then, just as suddenly, both Cho's laughter and the man's whispering stopped. I froze on the spot. Cho spoke in a laughter-tinged voice that was eerily clear in the darkness. "Oh, Cho. Huh? Who were you just talking to?" Cho replied. His calm query made me grit my teeth in frustration. He didn't grasp the situation at all. You can't answer. You can't turn around. I was certain of that. But Cho and Cho continued muttering to each other. Right behind me, Joshi banged the railing in annoyance, the metallic clangs echoing loudly. She was clearly irritated, but not as frightened as I was, and at least it didn't sound like she was. We lingered for a moment in the middle of the stairway. In that tense interval, as I stood there trembling, the last thing I wanted happened. Cho started laughing. It was the kind of laugh you get when something is so amusing you're nearly bursting. Almost a childlike giddiness. "Hey, S!" Cho's voice rang out cheerfully. "Enjoshi, Tikun, come here for a second." Tikun is me. I could sense Enjoshi hesitating behind me. "Don't turn around." I wanted to scream that warning, but my throat was too dry to form words. "Don't look back. Don't look back." Repeating that in my mind, I cautiously took another step. I'd never despised my own echoing footsteps so much. I could hear Enjoshi and S whispering to each other, but I had no brain space to pay attention. I was focused solely on descending. I was trembling uncontrollably. My co-workers' voices and that mysterious middle-aged man's whispers receded behind me. We passed the 4th floor, and then the 3rd. My progress was agonizingly slow. By that point, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely manage another step. After passing the 3rd floor, I glimpsed the dark emptiness below, the ground. Relief washed over me, and I picked up my pace. Fear had completely overshadowed any concern I had for my co-workers. That's when I felt someone closing in from behind. I heard multiple sets of footsteps, 4, maybe 5, descending swiftly. They were silent, not speaking a word, just marching straight down toward me. I swallowed my screams and raced down the stairs. At the bottom stood a fenced-off garbage disposal area, secured by a simple combination lock. The presence behind me was practically on top of me. Doing my best not to look back, I reached into the darkness, fumbling for the lock with my fingertips. That was when I sensed a faint movement of air behind me. Shh! What was that sound? My fingers kept working the lock, and I racked my brain to identify the noise. I had no intention of turning around. It was the slight rustle of air, the sound of breathing. Several people at my back were inhaling, all at once. Then, in the next moment, right next to my ear, they exhaled in unison, with blindingly cheerful voices. "Hey, T, turn around, we've got something great for you." "This is so much fun, Tikun, look at this." Tikun. Come on, there's no harm. Turn around, you'll like it. Hey, look, take a look at this. I could only just hold back a shriek. Their voices were mere inches behind my ear. Yet not one of them laid a hand on me. They used nothing but words, so excited and inviting, to get me to turn around. I heard someone screaming. When I realized who it was, it turned out I was the one screaming. The voices behind me became increasingly hysterical until it was just manic laughter without meaning. At that moment, something heavy and cold dropped into my palm with a clang. It was the lock. I'd managed to undo it without even noticing. Rather than relief, the sensation sent shivers through me. Finally, I could leave. I pushed the iron gate open in the dark. Just a few more meters and I'd be out on the street. But the moment I took a step forward, all the laughter behind me cut off. And then, that same middle-aged voice I'd heard first, low and clear, spoke a single word. "Hey!" I had just left a happy hour with some co-workers, completely wasted by the time I got home. Like any drunk person, I had two priorities: eat and sleep. After grabbing the easiest thing in my kitchen, I headed to my room. I glanced at my mum's bedroom. She was already asleep. Then dropped all my stuff and crashed onto my bed. Those were my last moments of peace. I don't remember exactly when I fell asleep, which made it even weirder when I suddenly woke up, my mouth dry as a desert. My water bottle was empty, forcing me to head to the kitchen. I cursed my past drunk self for not refilling it beforehand. The walk was strange. My TV was on, broadcasting news about a murder. Weird, I thought. I was sure I had turned it off earlier. Feeling uneasy, I kept going to the kitchen. It was oddly bright, like daylight, but the real red flag came when I saw my grandfather sitting at the table, casually reading a newspaper. He looked up, smiled kindly, and started talking about a job opening for me. Way too weird, I thought. My grandfather had been dead for 2 years. Before I could ask anything, the doorbell rang. I turned toward the sound and saw, through the glass, the torso of an impossibly tall man. He was so tall that his face and neck were out of view. My hand hovered over the doorknob, frozen. A paralyzing fear gripped me, a kind of terror I had never felt before. When I finally regained control of my body, I did the only thing my fear allowed me to. I grabbed the door with all my strength and screamed for my mother. My voice came out small, fragile, like a scared little kid. And that's when I realized it was all a dream. I woke up instantly, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. Nothing, just my furniture. But I knew something was wrong. The stench of decay filled my room, thick and overwhelming. I had no choice but to lie down and shut my eyes. After all, I was a 26-year-old woman. I couldn't let a nightmare freak me out, right? Wrong. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt something lurking in the dark corners of my room. I wasn't alone. I gave up trying to sleep and got up 2 hours earlier than usual for work. I told my co-workers about my dream, more as a way to vent than expecting any answers. As the day went on, I managed to forget about the whole thing. That night, I finally slept in peace. Or so I thought. The next morning at work, my friend rushed over, panicked. She had the exact same dream. The only difference was that instead of my grandfather, she saw her father, who had also passed away years ago. After lunch, another co-worker said the same thing, and then another. Everyone I had told about my dream had also seen the tall man. That night, I expected him to return, but nothing. The next night, nothing again. It was strange. I always dreamed, always. At work, my friend didn't show up. My boss said she had left for personal reasons, but the office gossip said it was a mental breakdown. Deborah had always talked about overcoming depression, so it seemed possible. I texted her, but she never replied. 5 nights after my last dream, he came back. This time, I got up, saw the same murder report on TV, but instead of my grandfather at the table, it was Deborah. She didn't smile kindly. Her eyes were sunken, as if she hadn't slept in days. Her mouth stretched into a forced, eerie grin. I knew what was coming next. "You have to tell them." That was all she said before the doorbell rang. As if possessed, I walked toward the door. He was there, tall man. Just like before, I could only see his torso, but this time I was about to open the door. My hands moved on their own. I screamed Deborah's name over and over as I saw him bending down, trying to enter. I woke up in my room. The same foul stench filled the air. I wasn't alone. The next morning, I told 3 more people about the dream and texted Deborah again, worried. Was my dream a warning that something had happened to her? I couldn't focus at work. I had a terrible feeling that the next time I saw him calling for help wouldn't matter. He would get in. I searched everywhere, urban legends, folklore, horror stories, anything about a tall man like this. Nothing. And then the news hit. Deborah had taken her own life, 2 days after my last dream. Her funeral was the next day. Everyone from work was there. As I approached her casket to pay my respects, I froze. Her skin was pale, her sunken eyes barely hidden under layers of makeup. She looked exactly as she had in my dream. "You have to tell them." She screamed it, right at me. Her dead eyes locked onto mine. I collapsed in terror, my heart pounding so loud I was sure everyone could hear it. Was I dreaming? Had I just hallucinated in broad daylight? I hadn't slept much the night before, but I wasn't about to ask if anyone else had heard her. She was dead, and I was losing my mind. Sitting at my desk, I finally understood. The first time I dreamed of the tall man, I told 5 people. I went 5 nights without seeing him. Deborah only told me. He came for her the next day. The last time I saw him, I only told 3. Today is my last day, so I'm writing this here. I'm sorry to everyone who reads this. I don't want to die. This is the only way to escape. Remember, tell everyone.